Welcome to Chasing Quicksilver. What is Chasing Quicksilver? Well, it's the search for the great mystery. My name is Shannon Douglas, and I haven't put up anything on this channel for a while. I've been thinking a lot about concepts that I've covered in under various frameworks on this channel in the past. During the pandemic lockdown, the first lockdown in 2020, I did a comprehensive week by week analysis of the symbols of the 22 cards of the Arcana of Tarot, which I think was an interesting time to be doing a meditation on the Arcana. Those 22 cards are simply, if you care to watch them, they're stories. They're memory hooks. They are a way of categorizing different human experiences from psychosocial development to various patterns of behavior and their resolutions. Lots of people like to get really scared when we talk about things like tarot and and get kind of reductionist. Now, tarot is one of many sets of symbols that contain, in some fashion, a collection of human wisdom. And we might look to the Eastern chakra system from Hinduism. We might look at the system of meridians in Chinese medicine. We could look at the Kabbalah. We could look at the medicine wheel from the indigenous traditions. There are many types, the runes of the Norse traditions, sets of symbols, and the various pantheons from religions around the world as sets of symbols. And tarot isn't any different. Um, I like to joke that when I do tarot cards, I only do birthday cards and Christmas cards. I don't read tarot as a predictive mechanism. I believe it's more of a descriptive and a prescriptive set of tools. If you understand the stories and can understand the implications as such, then there's a significant degree of utility within that set of stories. If you're curious about that, you can go and check out my tarot stuff. But I wanted to talk about what's going on in the world today. Critical social justice is something that we're increasingly becoming more and more aware of. And critical social justice, we might call it wokeism. Some people call it progressivism or progressive leftism. And under that rubric or under that banner, we have critical race theory, Black Lives Matter movement. We've got feminism and radical feminism. We have gender ideology, things like fat studies and decolonial studies or colonial and decolonial theories. And we start to get language like whiteness and oppression and systemic and all of this stuff that's infiltrating our institutions. And so, what I wanted to do is to address some of those major issues through various lenses that are provided by what people might traditionally call the occult. And there's a lot of stigma around that word. Okay. And I was listening to a professor of cognitive psychology, John Vervaeke, recently on one of his podcasts, and one of his guests brought up the word psychic. And Vervaeke was cautious in that moment to say, okay, like listeners, I want to convey to you what that word psychic means in this context. It's not reading someone's mind or practicing telekinesis or predicting the future or anything like that. It simply means the landscape of the mind. And the word occult is similar to that, in that occult means hidden or occluded. It has roots in the word eye, oculus, ocular, and it means clouded or hidden or beneath the surface. And some people use words like esoteric um, or, um, or other words like that to describe the occult. And we specifically use that word occult to refer to a Western tradition of what I'll call mysticism, which is a search for the nature, an understanding of the nature of the soul outside of the religious context of the West. And in the mid 1850s, we were suffering a meaning crisis in the West as rationalism, which had been born several hundred years earlier with the mathematics of Newton and the cogito ergo sum of Rene Descartes, and post Renaissance, we started to orient ourselves in the world in the West based on material facts that we could confirm. And Rene Descartes, his famous maxim cogito ergo sum, which means we translate as I think, therefore I am, is actually more about doubt. Um, where his methodology of doubt was to um, only trust in the world those things that we could prove and make demonstrably true. And it was the birth of the scientific method. And as this materialism, we could call it the Western Enlightenment, which is different from the Eastern Enlightenment or Eastern concept of enlightenment. But the Western Enlightenment was the birth of rationalism, the birth of science. And as that wave of human progress carried through in the modern world, and from that we got the birth of the nation state, we got our modern democracy, we got the scientific method, we rationalized all of our institutions. So what I mean by that is we went from doctors bloodletting and using leeches to treat fevers and infections to testing out methods systematically in reproducible and verifiable practices, so that we could go from a hypothesis or superstition to hypothesis to theory, um, and to standardize and systematize and scale technology like medicine. And that methodology, that rational process, that scientific method that we developed in the West in the last 5 centuries has led us to the capacity for me to sit in my office today in front of a camera, to record a monologue about these things, and then to be able to post it on the internet to have anyone in the world view it. By the mid 1800s, we had reached a point of a meaning crisis, and I borrow that word from or that phrase from John Vervaeke, who uses it frequently. But many people in the last decade have been talking about the meaning crisis that we're currently in. And the meaning crisis in the mid 1800s, so we're going back 150, 175 years ago, is reflected in the often quoted statement by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is God is dead. And he wasn't speaking literally that God had died, but that the process of the of a, let's call it a long march of materialism through the religious uh, broad culture that we lived in, that we had used to organize society up until that point as the guiding organizational structure, materialism was taking over. And we realized this through the new atheists, who, if you remember the four horsemen of the new atheists, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and Sam Harris, I think were the four horsemen there. It became apparent, if you followed the new atheists, that they were missing something, right? There is more to the world than just the physical world. And while they were pushing back against the toxicities and the rigid structures of religion that actually prevented people from self-actualization and realization, and in lots of ways, or sets of propositions that cause toxicity. There are very profoundly positive applications of religion. And I think that religion in the Christian context in the West has been a net benefit in the last 2 millennia to humanity. But it has its downsides, just like materialism does. So in the mid 1850s, God is dead, and it was a observation of people's renewed search for meaning. And we started to see a rise in occultism, what we look back and call occultism now. Organizations like the Order of the Golden Dawn and the Rosicrucians and the Theosophical Society, and people like Helena Blavatsky and Jiddu Krishnamurti and Aleister Crowley, who was referred to as the most evil man alive, got a lot of toxic branding, and like he was a bit of a weirdo. And we had births of religious traditions like the Church of Latter-day Saints, and I think his name was Smith. I want to say John Smith, but that's probably not it. Who founded the the Mormon church based on a series of visions that he had. We had the birth of the spiritualist church in North America, which embraces mediumship and psychic abilities in the full sense of the new age woo woo word psychic, and a lot of people talking about religions as we were amalgamating, for example, the stories of the oral tradition of Europe, the Brothers Grimm, and as anthropology was being birthed as a field, and as global trade was becoming faster and shorter. Right by the 1800s, the telegraph was starting to make available rapid communications, and in the decades that followed, the world became an awful lot smaller because of technology. So over those decades from the 1850s, people were exploring, searching out the answers to these questions about meaning. And we look back on those now, and uh, we refer to them as the occult. They've been largely stigmatized. It was very fashionable in the late 1800s to have these pursuits. And out of that body came a renewed interest in things like tarot, astrology, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, uh, Hebrew mysticism. And of the milieu, we had the emergence of medical doctor and psychologist Carl Jung. And Jung was interested in studying all these narratives and stories from around the world. He collected books, uh, had a substantial collection of books about alchemy and metaphysics, and these various symbols, and he wrote books about them in his quest to understand the nature of the psyche. And now, this is the domain of the psychic, right? Psyche, it means soul in its earliest um, utilizations, and it also means breath, as in the breath of life. And Psyche is also a goddess, or a referred to as a feminine goddess in the Greek tradition, and it's really she is kind of the ground on upon which the interactions of our psychic parts and forces play. Our different drives, let's say. So if we imagine our own psychic field, that is who we are. We have a conscious mind, and we have unconscious forces. And there's good modern language around some of this stuff. I will use internal family systems as a reference point, because we have legitimately parts of us inside that come out at different times, and those at a primal level can be emotional, and they can be instinctual, and they can rise up and they can kind of dominate the psychic, uh, let's call it tableau, our mental desktop. They can come to the surface and drive us. For example, erotic love, or passions and attraction can take us over at times, and anger as a spirit, Jordan Peterson talks about this, can take over at times, and fear can take over at times. And these are various parts of our constituent parts of our psyche, of our self overall. And sometimes they come to the forefront, and sometimes they recede. In internal family systems theory, this breaks down into, or the theory breaks down into family parts that we have inside of us. We have an internal father, we have an internal mother. The household, or the circumstance within which we were raised and how we were socialized, imprints upon us or internalizes within us these various structures. So in development, children growing up need parents to keep them from putting their hand on the hot stove or running out into traffic, and they require our adult brains to be able to guide them until such time as they can internalize those processes within themselves. And so in internal family systems theory, I mean, I'm being quite general about this, but we internalize those various parts of ourselves and they become part of our unconscious. These are the lessons that we've learned in the environment that we've grown up in. So what we understand as the occult had this understanding, and in fact, I will argue, has had this understanding for thousands of years. It's still manifest in various uh, uh, epistemological frames in various cultures in the world today. And we have largely forgotten this in the West because we have rationalized away any any serious contemplation of the internal workings of the psyche. It's only maybe in the past 25 or 30 years that some psychologists, some brain researchers, some neuroscientists have started to get to a point where this stuff can be reflected in scientific language because we recognize that there's correlations within brain function to some of these issues. And nevertheless, it's still taboo to bring up things like alchemy and Gnosticism and Hermeticism. So why specifically am I talking about that? Well, um, recently, let's say in the last year or so, one of the leading figures in the pushback against wokeness or critical social justice, a fierce, tenacious intellectual who deserves a ton of credit for informing people and giving people some of the language to push back on this, James Linsday. James has been talking about Gnosticism and Hermeticism as the thread through time that has led to communism and wokeness and critical social justice. And he's flat wrong. Uh, my argument, and I can get into this in another video, but basically what James Linsday has done, and he's simply building on the work of a guy by the name of Eric Voegelin. Voegelin wrote about this in the he talked about it in the early 50s. He wrote about it in mid to late 50s, published some books, and made this part of his talking points. He came from a Catholic background. He was basing his understandings of Hermeticism and Gnosticism based on Catholic teachings and what work was available and had been published about the first heresy. And the first heresy was what we call Gnosticism in the Catholic Church. So there was a schism within the that I want to say the fourth century in the 300s and the 400s to push back against the residual culture of the Mediterranean and the Levant. That because we were instituting a monolithic governing structure, religion, under a monotheistic authority, under one God. And there was a process happening of integrating the various pantheons or simply banishing them and burning them, declaring them heretical and burning their texts. And Gnosticism and Hermeticism were intertwined philosophies at that time that were subsumed by the Roman Catholic Church and the emerging religious order. And Linsday makes the argument that it's Gnosticism that and the beliefs of Gnosticism that have contributed to wokeness and critical social justice. Now, I don't say this very often, but I identify as a hermit. I identify as a Gnostic. And I believe that the concepts found in these epistemologies are important and significant enough that they can have a useful analytical application about the circumstances that we're currently in, and that they don't need to continue on as heresies, not as heresies to the religious order and not as heresies to the rational order. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the fundamental principles of alchemy and some of the first edicts, or some of the first maxim of alchemy. And I'm going to talk about family systems. I'm going to talk about scale and how toxicity scales. And I'm going to tie that to the Emerald Tablet of Hermes. Now, there's a lot that I have to say about Hermes and these religious traditions. So much so that I wrote a book about it called Chasing Quicksilver, and that book is published as an audio on this YouTube channel. If you want to check it out, start with the prologue, and there are 10 chapters, and I guide readers through a a participatory experience of a number of different brain functions that we personify into gods and demigods. And those internal parts that the first century and second century alchemists and hermits wrote about haven't changed ever. The dynamics were then understood and are still now understood. They're just being presented today in slightly different language. So part of the reason why I think James Linsday is way off on this is because he's coming at it from a biased perspective. He's coming through Vervaeke, who came through the Catholic interpretation of what Gnosticism is. And when you have an institution or an organization or a power structure that declares an enemy, they're not going to tell you the truth about the enemy. But in order to mobilize against that enemy, you need propaganda. And in order to like really cement the opposition as evil, you have to project on them the most hideous kinds of evil that there are. So think of the Satanic Panic, if you remember what that is. The Satanic Panic was a massive social contagion tied to repressed memory syndrome that swept North America in the 90s. And it was driven in part by some movies and news stories and the field of psychology, actually, that had documented these so-called repressed memories. What was the tie? The tie was that people who have trauma or certain negative psychological manifestations in the present moment, this is due to trauma, and trauma and by way of sexual trauma or psychological, physical abuse trauma, those sorts of things. There was this trauma model of dysfunction, and someone decided in this exploration in the field of psychology that for those people that were coming in, I remember, it was multiple personalities. Multiple personalities was the result of trauma. But people were coming in claiming multiple personalities who had no history of trauma. And then the conclusion drawn and the argument made in the field of psychology was that it was repressed trauma. So psychologists, in having people in vulnerable situations, started to elicit false memories through various types of therapy, including hypnosis and hypnotic regression and those sorts of things. And people came up with these hideous narratives of murdering babies and child sacrifices and all kinds of sexual abuse, and patterns started to emerge of hideous evil. And human beings have used this mechanism of projecting onto enemies for centuries, forever, for that matter. It's a function of tribal man. It's us versus them, in group versus out group. A good example of this was I don't remember the French king's name, and at the time is in 1304, the French king was significantly indebted to the very wealthy Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar, I think, were among the first bankers of Europe. They had a system of being able to move money from place to place, a lot like the Muslims use today. You make your deposit in one country, you can withdraw it in another through networks of high trust. And the French king had borrowed a tremendous amount of money in order to finance his wars from the Knights Templar. And instead of paying the money back, his solution to the indebtedness was to destroy the Templar Knights. And so accusations of worshiping Baphomet and child sacrifice and drinking blood and sodomy and all of this stuff. It's kind of like the same package of the most hideous evil that you want to project onto somebody. You know, institutions and bullies have done this forever. So this is the state of understanding that people generally have about things like the occult and things like Hermeticism and things like Gnosticism, that what their common understandings are what the negative projections are from people who in whose interest it is to suppress the knowledge. But the knowledge can never be suppressed because it is a universal human experience. So the meaning crisis, we have a meaning crisis in the 1800s. We had this rebirth or reconnection to ancient knowledge that came from traditions all around the world, Chinese philosophy, Hinduism, indigenous traditions, Siberian shamanism, the folk tales of Europe, the stories of the indigenous people of North America, oral traditions were all amalgamated. And then we started to look at those and to ascertain patterns in them. What are the commonalities? And there is a I think the only valid interpretation of this, when we look at the various patterns, is that there are common themes in all religious and, let's call them again, psychic traditions. And those psychic traditions have to do with the question, what is the great mystery? What is our relationship with God or with the gods? And who are we as human beings in light of that? So in broad scale, what I want to be doing is addressing some of the questions in the current environment. We are in a precarious position in the West where it is foreseeable that we could fall to authoritarian and totalitarian institutions, structures, and government. The signs are unfortunately too frequent, and we are losing our ability to speak the truth publicly about what the truth is and about what human dignity is and about what right relationships are and about what high trust societies and communities need to be. We're losing traditions around human biology, uh, the nuclear family. We can't tell what a boy and a girl is anymore. We have institutions teaching children you can choose your sex. The archetypes of male and female in the culture at large, in terms of our understanding, are collapsing. We have boys who want to be girls, and we largely have, it seems, a an effete uh, uh, takeover or emergent property where young men have no connection with their masculinity. It's been socialized. Um, the socialization has repressed masculinity in boys and has brought out aggressive masculinity in girls to such extent that girls are taking testosterone and boys are taking antidepressants or estrogen. Worse. To me, all of this is archetypal. There is an internal individual psychology at play here, but there are the same patterns function at large. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in another piece. This has been kind of getting some of the thoughts off my chest and exploring what I'm going to be talking about with Chasing Quicksilver on this channel. I'm I'm gonna who are the groups, let's imagine, who are fighting against critical social justice, and where are they coming from? There are the feminist groups and the women's rights campaigners. There are the child safeguarding people, the parents. There are groups of academics in academia who are attempting to hold bulwarks of freedom of expression and freedom of capacity to research and speak. FIRE movement is a good example in the US, or FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. People like Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff. There are Christians. The traditional Christians have been pushing back against this critical social justice for quite some time because they have a sensitivity to it. There are medical professionals who are trying to hold on to the integrity of their professions by speaking the truth, and the forces of destabilization, the woke activists, are making it nearly impossible in many environments to actually speak the truth. So, as we know, there are lots of people who are uh, afraid of speaking biological reality in their work environments. We have people in Canada like Amy Ham, who's been under investigation for 3 years as a psychiatric nurse, who on her own time had the temerity to say that a man can't be a woman and that biology is real and important distinctions in our lives. Um, we have people pushing it back against the big lies, like Jim McMurtry, a teacher in British Columbia, uh, who told his students that it was unlikely that it was more likely that kids died in residential schools due to tuberculosis and disease and infections of the day, and that there wasn't a mass murder and genocide. And Jordan Peterson's an obvious example, but many more in their own lives in much smaller ways that are not public have been suffering these attacks and this poison in our institutions. What we have is a broadly established reality distortion field, a set of lies. Maybe it's 4 or 5 big lies that have made their way into our institutions at all levels. And any questioning of those big lies results in um, social abuses, attacks, ostracization, exclusion, abuse, job loss, economic compromise. So if you don't toe the line in the West on several of these subjects, and you're happen to be in the wrong environment, you're going to pay a very heavy price. So, in many ways, the truth has become the occult. It has become occluded. Reality itself has become occluded from the reality distortion field at large that's promulgated by legacy media and various meaning making institutions and platforms that we have. And the truth has become taboo, much like many organizations through centuries have become taboo. They become demonized and assigned characteristics and behaviors and sins that they actually didn't deserve. I hope that you'll follow along what I'm doing with Chasing Quicksilver. I have set up a Twitter channel called @NeoHermetic, where I'm tweeting about some of these things. And I'll be linking some videos there as well. And over the next while, I'm going to take time with uh, more specific topics and explorations around issues centered on the idea of and the philosophical concepts and constructs that emerge and have been passed down through to us through the centuries from Hermeticism and Gnosticism. In the next video, I'm going to talk about what those things are. My name is Shannon Douglas. This is Chasing Quicksilver on my YouTube. Feel free to follow me on Twitter at NeoHermetic. And I'd love to get your comments, your thoughts, your feedbacks. And maybe if you've got topic ideas, I'd be happy to take them in the comments.